The sterile hum of the ultrasound machine was the only sound in the room as Alexis Bryant gripped the edge of the examination table, her knuckles stark against her dark skin. She stared at the back of Sang-hoon's tailored suit, waiting for him to offer a hand, a word, anything to anchor her against the fear of the results. She couldn't have heard him correctly. "I'm filing for divorce, Alexis." Sang-hoon didn't turn around. He stood near the door, jaw tight and eyes fixed on the blank wall, his posture radiating a cold, final authority. He said it again, the words cutting through the clinical air like a scalpel. "I'm filing for divorce. I should have done this before the tests, but I couldn't find the right time." The door swung open, and Dr. Patterson froze, a manila folder clutched against her white lab coat. Her eyes darted between Alexis's tear-streaked face and Sang-hoon's rigid back. "I'm sorry," the doctor whispered, sensing the wreckage she'd just walked into. "I can give you a moment." "No," Alexis's voice cracked as she pressed a hand firmly against her abdomen. "Whatever those results say, just say it." The silence in the room was thick enough to suffocate, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic crinkle of the paper lining the examination table as Alexis shifted her weight. "Dr. Patterson didn't look at Sang-hoon. Her focus remained entirely on the file in her hands, her expression a mix of clinical professional and startled witness. Alexis felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of blue hospital cotton. She had prepared herself for the word cancer, had braced her soul for a battle with her own cells, but the words that actually left the doctor's mouth felt like a different kind of explosion. "Mrs. Yoon, you aren't sick," Dr. Patterson said, her voice steadying as she stepped further into the room. "The nausea, the exhaustion, it isn't a symptom of a disease. You're pregnant. 11 weeks along." The world didn't just stop, it inverted. Alexis felt her hand move instinctively to her stomach, her fingers splaying over the fabric of her gown as if she could feel the tiny life already making a home there. 11 weeks. Nearly 3 months. She thought of the long shifts at the hospital she'd worked to cover their mounting debts, the dizzy spells she'd dismissed as stress, and the cold realization that she had been carrying hope while her husband was carrying a departure. Behind her, she heard the sharp intake of breath as Sang-hoon's rigid posture finally broke. The man who had just stood there with the cold, tailored precision of a stranger suddenly looked as though the floor had vanished beneath his expensive shoes. He turned, his face losing every drop of color, his jaw hanging slightly slack as he stared at her midsection. That isn't possible," he stammered, the authoritative edge of his divorce voice replaced by a hollow, fragile vibration. "We haven't. I mean, with the restaurant and my mother, we barely." 11 weeks, Sang-hoon, Alexis interrupted, her voice sounding like ice cracking on a winter lake. She met his eyes, and for the first time in months, he didn't look away. "The cabin weekend. Your birthday." The memory hit them both, the one weekend they had managed to escape the crushing weight of his mother's expectations and the bleeding accounts of the family business. For 48 hours, they had been the couple who married at the altar 4 years ago, before the silence and the secrets had taken root. Dr. Patterson cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the radiating tension. "I'll leave you two to process this. The nurse will be in shortly with the prenatal paperwork." She slipped out, and the click of the door felt like a gavel coming down in a silent courtroom. Sang-hoon took a stumbling step toward the bed, his hand reaching out as if to touch her, then flinching back as if he'd remembered the words he'd spoken only moments before. He looked small now, deflated in his designer suit. "Alexis," he whispered, but she didn't want to hear his voice. She just stared at him, the man who had been ready to leave her for dead, now standing in the wreckage of his own timing. The air in the sterile room felt thin, as if the pregnancy news had sucked the oxygen out of the space, leaving only the cold, sharp remnants of Sang-hoon's divorce request. He stood by the bed now, his shoulders slumped and his expensive suit looking suddenly too large for his frame. The silence stretched until it was unbearable, a physical weight pressing against Alexis's chest as she watched the man who had been ready to leave her for dead just moments before. "Alexis, I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "If I had known about the baby, I never would have said those things." "So that's the bar?" Alexis asked, her voice dangerously calm as she slid off the examination table to stand on shaky legs. "If I'm dying of cancer, I'm disposable. But if I'm carrying your heir, I'm suddenly worth staying for." She stepped into his personal space, forcing him to meet her glossy, tear-streaked eyes. "Who is she, Sang-hoon? Who is the good Korean girl your mother has been grooming to take my place?" Sang-hoon flinched as if she had struck him, his eyes darting toward the closed door. "It's not like that. My mother, she's been under a lot of pressure." "Don't you dare blame her for your choices," Alexis cut him off, her words coming out like ice. "I've seen the way she looks at Yuna. I've seen the way she treats her like the daughter-in-law she actually wanted. The proper girl from a good family who doesn't have my skin or my hair." She felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. "Is that why you've been coming home late? Is that why you flinch every time I try to touch you?" "Because Yuna is exactly what she wants for you." Sang-hoon's silence was the only confirmation she needed. He ran his hands through his hair, pulling at the roots in a gesture of frantic desperation. "She told me I made a mistake, Alexis. For 2 years, she told me the restaurant was failing because I chose you over my heritage. She said I needed someone who understood our traditions. And you believed her," Alexis said, the realization hitting her harder than the divorce papers ever could. "While I was taking extra shifts at the hospital to keep your business afloat, while I stopped buying myself new clothes so your family wouldn't lose their status, you were listening to her tell you I wasn't enough." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the ghost of the man she had married, now replaced by a puppet whose strings were being pulled from a hotel suite across town. "You didn't just ask for a divorce in a hospital room, Sang-hoon. You let her erase me before the doctor even walked in." 3 days passed in a blur of hollow silence and heavy chests. Alexis didn't stay to watch Sang-hoon grapple with his guilt. She couldn't breathe in the house that had become a monument to his mother's expectations. She moved into her sister Tamika's apartment on the other side of the city, carrying the weight of a secret life and the wreckage of a 4-year promise. The packing had been surgical. She ignored the expensive dresses Sang-hoon's mother had bought to make her look appropriate and the jewelry that felt like gilded shackles. Instead, she folded her faded nursing scrubs, the fabric smelling of hospital soap and the honest labor that had actually kept their lights on. In the corner of the dresser sat a small porcelain figurine Sang-hoon had given her on their first anniversary, back when he still looked at her like she was his entire world. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the cool ceramic before she tucked it into her bag. She didn't know why she brought it, perhaps as a reminder of the man she had actually married before the ghost took his place. Tamika handed her a cup of ginger tea, the steam curling upward like an unanswered question. Her sister was 6 years older, possessed of a no-nonsense attitude born from raising 3 kids and surviving a betrayal of her own. She sat on the couch, watching Alexis with a gaze that was both fierce and protective. "You're really not going back?" Tamika asked, her voice low. "I don't know," Alexis whispered, staring into the amber liquid. "How do I go back to a man who thought I was dying and decided that was the perfect time to leave? He messed up." "Bad," Tamika said, leaning forward. "But you're carrying a life now, Lex. That changes the math, even if it doesn't change the hurt." Alexis felt her hand instinctively drift to her stomach, where a tiny heartbeat was now the only thing anchoring her to the world. "It doesn't change what he was about to do," she countered, her voice gaining a dangerous, icy edge. "He was going to run because he's a coward, Tamika. He was drowning, and instead of reaching for me, he tried to push me under." The apartment was quiet, the city lights outside flickering like distant memories of a life she no longer recognized. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, an unknown number. Alexis almost ignored it, her spirit too exhausted for another telemarketer or a filtered apology from Sang-hoon. But a strange intuition made her swipe the screen. "Hello," she said, her voice hollow. "Is this Alexis Bryant?" The voice on the other end was female, soft, and carried a distinct Korean accent. Alexis felt her blood run cold, the name she had spat at Sang-hoon just days ago echoing in her mind. "Who's asking?" "My name is Yuna," the woman replied. "And I think we should talk." The meeting took place at a quiet coffee shop near the waterfront, a neutral ground where the salt air bit at Alexis's cheeks and the gray morning light offered no place for secrets to hide. Alexis arrived early, her nursing scrubs replaced by a heavy coat that she pulled tight over her stomach, a silent shield for the life growing inside her. She didn't want witnesses for this. She didn't want Tamika's protective fire or Sang-hoon's stuttering apologies. She wanted the truth, raw and unvarnished. Yuna was already there, a delicate woman with flawless skin and hair pulled back into a neat, professional ponytail. She looked exactly like the woman Mrs. Yoon would adore, traditional, proper, and effortlessly Korean. She was everything Alexis had been told she was not. "Thank you for coming," Yuna said softly as Alexis sat across from her, her voice carrying a gentle accent that made Alexis's jaw tighten instinctively. "I didn't come for you," Alexis replied, her voice steady but cold. "I know enough not to trust anything you have to say." Yuna didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes clouding with a weary kind of honesty. "Then let me be honest. I never pursued your husband. His mother brought me from Korea specifically to be near him." She explained how Mrs. Yoon had arranged their chance meetings, hired her at the restaurant, and whispered in her ear that Sang-hoon and Alexis were already separated. "She told me you were the mistake he was trying to fix," Yuna whispered. "But I saw the way he looked when he talked about you. He loves you, Alexis. He just doesn't know how to fight for you because that woman has spent his entire life breaking his spirit." Alexis felt a flicker of something other than rage, a hollow, sickening realization. "So what are you saying? That I should feel sorry for the man who asked for a divorce while I was waiting for a biopsy?" "I'm saying I refuse to be her weapon anymore," Yuna said, her voice turning sharp and cold. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it across the scarred wooden table. "What is this?" Alexis asked, her fingers hovering over the edge. "Everything," Yuna replied. "Recordings of her phone calls instructing me to get close to him. Texts where she admits she's been lying to both of us. Bank statements showing she's been funneling money out of the restaurant to make it fail so she could blame Sang-hoon and force him back to Korea." Alexis opened the folder, her breath hitching as she saw the calculated, deliberate destruction of her husband's dreams orchestrated by his own mother. It wasn't just a marriage being dismantled, it was a man's entire identity. She never wanted him to succeed here, Yuna said firmly. She wanted to break him so he would have nowhere else to go but back to her. The folder sat between them like a ticking bomb, and for the first time in months, Alexis felt the fog of confusion lift to reveal a path forward, one that was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. That night, the quiet of Tamika's living room felt heavy, the only sound being the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that seemed to count down the seconds of a life Alexis no longer recognized. She sat on the floor, The manila folder spread open before her like a map of a minefield. As she pulled out the first set of transcripts, her hands began to shake, not from the lingering fear of the hospital room, but from a cold, piercing clarity. She read the words of her mother-in-law, Mrs. Yoon, captured in black and white. There were phone logs instructing subordinates to delay shipments to Sang-hoon's restaurant and text messages detailing how to funnel spare dollars out of the business accounts to ensure the venture would bleed money. It was a calculated, deliberate destruction of her husband's dreams, orchestrated by the woman who was supposed to be his greatest advocate. Alexis felt a lump form in her throat as she realized the depth of the deception. For 8 months, she had taken extra shifts at the hospital, wearing old clothes and skipping meals to pour every cent into a failing business that was actually being systematically dismantled from the inside. She saw the transcripts where Mrs. Yoon laughed about how that woman, Alexis, was struggling to keep up, using the financial strain as a wedge to convince Sang-hoon that marrying her had been his greatest mistake. The evidence was undeniable. Every failure Sang-hoon had blamed on himself, every late night spent staring at spreadsheets in despair, had been a trap planted and nurtured by his own mother. She had made him believe he was weak, that he was a disappointment who belonged back in Korea, while she secretly held the knife that was cutting his ties to America. By the time Alexis reached the final page, she felt a shift inside her. The anger she had felt for Sang-hoon's cowardice was still there, but it was now joined by a fierce, protective resolve. He wasn't just a man who had tried to leave her. He was a man who had been hollowed out by a monster. She looked at the sonogram tucked into the corner of the folder, the tiny, 11-week-old life that Mrs. Yoon didn't even know existed yet. Alexis closed the folder, the sabotage file now a weapon in her own hands. She realized then that she couldn't just walk away and let the woman who had tried to destroy them win. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over Sang-hoon's name. He needed to see this. He needed to know that the man who asked for a divorce in a hospital room wasn't really him. It was the puppet his mother had spent years creating. Sang-hoon arrived at Tamika's apartment within the hour, looking like a man who had been hollowed out by his own guilt. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness, and the tailored suit that usually signaled his authority now seemed to hang off his slumped shoulders. Alexis stood by the small dining table, the manila folder resting under the glow of a single overhead light. She didn't offer him tea or a seat. The time for pleasantries had died in that hospital room. "Sit down, Sang-hoon," she said, her voice steady and dangerously calm. He obeyed without a word, dropping into the chair like a man who had stopped expecting mercy. Alexis pushed the folder toward him. "You told me you wanted a divorce because you were drowning. You told me you were a disappointment, a failure who couldn't keep his business afloat or his family happy. Read this." Sang-hoon reached for the papers with trembling hands. As his eyes moved down the first page of transcripts, his face began to shift. The confusion transitioned into a stark, pale disbelief, then into a deep-seated horror. He read his mother's words, her instructions to sabotage his supply lines, her calculated moves to drain his bank accounts, and her cold admissions that she was doing it all to break his spirit and force him back to Korea. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice cracking as he gripped the edge of the table. "Yuna brought it to me," Alexis replied, her gaze unblinking. She refused to be her mother's weapon any longer. Sang-hoon let out a choked, jagged sound, a mix of a sob and a laugh. "I thought I was failing because I wasn't good enough. I thought I was losing everything because I was weak." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing rage. "She did this. My own mother did this to us. She didn't just do it to you, Sang-hoon. She did it to me. She did it to our child," Alexis said, her hand resting firmly on her abdomen. She stepped closer, forcing him to look at the man in the mirror, not the failure his mother created, but the man who had been systematically dismantled. You were never weak. You were sabotaged. But you almost let her win. You almost walked away from the only person who actually fought for you. Sang-hoon stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He dropped to his knees in front of her, reaching for her hands. "I don't deserve another chance," he gasped, his forehead resting against her palms. "But please, let me prove I can be the man you married. The one who used to believe we could make it." Alexis looked down at him, her heart heavy with years of pain and invisible battles. "If I give you another chance, it's not because I've forgiven you yet. It's because I believe people can change," she said slowly. "But understand this. If you ever let her or anyone come between us again, I am gone. And I am taking our child with me." "I understand," he whispered, his jaw clenching with a new, firm resolve. "I'm done being her puppet." The lobby of the Ritz-Carlton was a sanctuary of marble and hushed opulence, a world away from the sterile hospital room and the cramped apartment where Sang-hoon's life had nearly unraveled. He stood in the center of his mother's suite, the certified letter and the manila folder clutched in his hand like a shield. Mrs. Yoon sat by the window, draped in silk, looking every bit the matriarch who moved people like chess pieces. She had flown to Boston expecting an apology, an announcement of his divorce, or perhaps a grandchild she could finally mold into her own image. "You're late, Sang-hoon," she said, her voice sharp with a practiced authority that had once made his knees weak. "I assume the papers are signed?" "I'm not here to give you a divorce, Mother," Sang-hoon said, his voice calm, steady, and for the first time in his life, completely unshakable. He crossed the room and dropped the sabotage file onto the mahogany coffee table between them. "I'm here to tell you that I know. I know about the shipments. I know about the bank accounts. And I know about Yuna." Mrs. Yoon didn't flinch. She barely glanced at the evidence of her own cruelty. "I did what was best for this family," she replied, her chin lifting in a gesture of cold defiance. "That woman was a mistake. She was dragging you down, making you soft. You belong in Korea, running the empire I built for you, not playing house in a failing restaurant in America. You didn't do what was best for me." Sang-hoon stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, no longer the puppet she had spent years dismantling. "You did what was best for your ego. You sabotaged my business and manipulated my marriage because you couldn't control a son who actually loved his wife. If you walk out that door, you have nothing," she hissed, her lips trembling with a fury she could no longer hide. "I will disown you. I will cut you off financially. You will be a nobody. I've already rebuilt without your money once, and I'll do it again," Sang-hoon said, turning toward the door. He stopped, but he didn't look back at the woman who had tried to destroy his future. "I am a grown man with a wife and a child on the way. I am done letting you destroy what I've built." "Sang-hoon," she called out, her voice cracking for the first time, stripped of its usual power. "When you're ready to treat my wife with the respect she deserves, you know where to find me," he said, his hand on the heavy brass handle. "Until then, consider this goodbye." He walked out of the suite, the click of the door sounding like the snapping of a chain. For the first time in 32 years, he stepped onto the sidewalk of Boston and felt like he could finally breathe. 6 months later, the apartment they had reclaimed was no longer a place of quiet ghosts, but a home echoing with the scent of fresh cedar and the steady, rhythmic sound of a hammer hitting a nail. The spare room, once a cluttered storage space for the remnants of their old lives, had been transformed into a nursery. Sang-hoon stood in the center of the room, his white dress shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his forehead damp with the honest sweat of a man who had stopped relying on others to build his world. He had spent weeks in this room, working late into the evening after his shifts at the restaurant, which was finally beginning to stabilize under his own management. He had refused to buy a pre-assembled crib from a catalog. Instead, he had sourced the wood himself, sanding every edge until it was as smooth as silk, ensuring there wasn't a single splinter that could harm the daughter who was now only weeks away from joining them. The white crib sat against the pale yellow walls, a sturdy monument to a man who was no longer content to be a puppet. Alexis stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the heavy, rounded curve of her swollen belly. She watched him adjust a small rocking chair in the corner, a piece he had built by hand, piece by piece, as a silent apology for every time he had let her stand alone. The natural curls of her hair caught the soft afternoon light, and for the first time in years, the tension that had once lived in her jaw was gone. Sang-hoon looked up, his eyes bright and clear, lacking the haunted, hollow look of the man who had once asked for a divorce in a cold examination room. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms gently around her waist, his touch no longer hesitant or flinching, but grounded and sure. "What do you think?" he asked softly, resting his chin against her hair. "I think you actually built something that won't fall apart," Alexis replied, a genuine smile tugging at her lips. He laughed softly, a sound of pure relief. "First time for everything." She turned in his arms to face him, searching his expression. The man before her was different, stronger, not because of his family's money or his mother's approval, but because he had finally learned to value the foundation he was laying with his own two hands. "Are you happy?" she asked, her voice a quiet anchor in the room. "I'm terrified," he admitted, his honesty raw and unfiltered. "But yes, I'm the happiest I've ever been." As he spoke, the baby kicked firmly against his palm where it rested on her stomach, and they both looked down at the same time, sharing a moment of wonder that needed no words. She was strong, just like her mother, and as Sang-hoon met Alexis's eyes, he knew he had finally become a man worth staying for. The hospital room was bathed in the soft, amber glow of a sunset that filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the bassinet where Nari lay sleeping. She was perfect, a full head of dark, curly hair and tiny fingers that curled instinctively around the air as she dreamt. Alexis lay in the bed, her body exhausted but her spirit finally at peace, watching Sang-hoon whisper the name Nari, which meant lily in Korean, as he looked at their daughter with a wonder that brought tears to his eyes. The quiet was broken by a hesitant knock, and the door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Yoon. She was no longer the imposing figure in silk from the Ritz-Carlton. She looked smaller, her elegant suit replaced by a simple coat, and her eyes were fixed solely on the infant in the room. Sang-hoon tensed immediately, stepping between his mother and the bed, but Alexis placed a hand on his arm, a silent command for him to wait. "I know I have no right to be here, Mrs. Yoon said, her voice stripped of its usual authority and trembling with a rare, raw vulnerability. "I came to apologize. Not because I expect you to forgive me, but because I have spent the last 6 months watching my son become a man I never allowed him to be." She finally met Alexis's eyes, her gaze steady and unblinking. "He is happy because of you, Alexis." Alexis felt the weight of the past 4 years, the silence, the sabotage, and the coldness, but she looked down at Nari and felt a shift in the air. She was no longer the invisible wife. She was the matriarch of this new family, and she would set the terms for its future. "I will never forget what you did," Alexis said, her voice like ice, but tempered with a hard-won wisdom. "But I believe that people can change if they are shown how. If you want to be a part of Nari's life, you will earn it." She leaned forward, her gaze locking onto her mother-in-law's. "No more money. No more control. You will treat me and my husband with respect, or you will not see this child again. Do you understand?" Mrs. Yoon swallowed hard, then slowly she nodded. I understand. As the older woman quietly left the room, Sang-hoon let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned down to kiss Alexis's forehead. Thank you, he whispered against her skin, for not giving up on me. Alexis closed her eyes and smiled, the warmth of her daughter and the strength of her husband finally enough to anchor her home. Thank you, she whispered back, for finally becoming the man worth staying for.